Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Lily Kelly. I'm a project manager at Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber, part of the UK Health Innovation Network. We are funded by NHS England to support innovation within the NHS and deliver national and local programmes. I'm here today to reflect on our organisational journey of developing our carbon reduction plan, hopefully offering some practical feedback from our development. As a background, I will also touch on why carbon reduction plans are important to healthcare systems and implications for innovators, reflecting on feedback from innovators that we work with. So today I'm going to briefly cover what a carbon reduction plan is, why would you need a carbon reduction plan, and then focus on how we developed our carbon reduction plan at Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber. And then finally, hopefully, reflect on feedback from innovators as well. So to start with then, let's explore what a carbon reduction plan is and why you may need one. A carbon reduction plan, or CRP for short, to save me saying that word too much, is a document that outlines an organisation's carbon accounting with a baseline footprint and annual progress update. A carbon reduction plan also articulates an organisation's sustainability ambitions by committing to a net zero target and outlining projects that will deliver emissions reductions. Emission reduction activity not only covers direct reductions, for example, switching to sustainable energy providers, but can also include wider strategies to deliver sustainable benefits, such as development of an organisational culture to deliver company outputs in a more sustainable way. The CRP template was developed by the UK government as a mechanism to ensure net zero ambitions are accounted for in procurement contracts, and it was implemented by the UK government in September 2021. To support compliance, they also developed a standards framework, catchily titled PPN 0621, and a template for your carbon reduction plan, both of which are linked and will be available to you after this presentation. The NHS has adopted the UK government framework, and we will talk more in a moment about NHS implementation. As you will have seen from the carbon reduction plan template displayed in the previous slide, your organisational carbon footprint will need to be summarised by scope of emissions. You will see from the NHS depiction on screen emissions by scope, which include Scope 1 emissions from owned or controlled sources, for example, gas heating systems or air conditioning refrigerants. Scope 2 covers emissions from purchased or acquired electricity, so your local utility provider. And it's helpful to note that Scope 1 and 2 emissions are considered as under direct control of an organisation and are therefore considered as the NHS carbon footprint. Scope 3 emissions include all other emissions generated from organisational activity, such as purchased goods and services, travel and transport. To comply with current reporting requirements, so the UK government standards, organisations are only required to report on a subset of Scope 3 emissions, and they include upstream transportation and distribution, waste generated in operations, business travel, employee commuting, and downstream transportation and distribution. Scope 3 emissions are considered as under the organisation's influence, but not directly controlled, and are therefore considered as the NHS Carbon Footprint Plus. As potentially already mentioned, the NHS has committed to net zero for NHS carbon footprint, Scope 1 and 2, by 2040, and net zero by 2045 for the NHS Carbon Footprint Plus. Okay, so we've talked about what a CRP is and started to indicate why a CRP is important, but let's explore that in a bit more detail. On screen, you can see a depiction of the Greener NHS Net Zero Supplier Roadmap. This outlines key milestones on NHS progress to date, the blue circles, and highlights supplier roadmap targets to achieve net zero ambitions, the green triangles. Greener NHS is clear that the climate emergency is a health emergency, with the environment we live in having a significant impact on our personal health. The NHS net zero ambitions are aligned to the UK government, which implemented the Climate Change Act in 2008, which originally committed to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, compared to 1990 levels. In 2019, the UK government declared a climate emergency and committed to net zero by 2050. As one of the largest employers in the UK, and equivalent to an estimated 4% of England's carbon footprint, in 2020, Greener NHS launched to build on the work of the NHS Sustainable Development Unit to establish a practical, evidence-based path to net zero. UK governmental policy and legislation has supported the NHS to strengthen the mandate for environmental sustainability, and in 2020-2021, the NHS standard contract included requirements for providers to produce an approved green plan and annual progress reporting requirements. In 2022, the Health and Care Act strengthened the NHS's response to climate change, and with additional statutory duties to contribute to emissions targets, as demonstrated by the blue dots on the timeline. The depiction also includes targets for NHS supply chain, with tools such as a carbon reduction plan to support sustainable procurement and progress awareness of Scope 3 emissions within the NHS supply chain. As a focus of my session, you will notice the milestones in April 23 and 24 for the implementation of carbon reduction plan requirements in the procurement process, and further strengthening of net zero ambitions by April 2027, where you should align to the NHS net zero target of 2045. Now I'm going to move on to focus on how we have developed ours as an organisation. To help with understanding our organisational development of a carbon reduction plan, it's helpful to know a bit about us as an organisation. So Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber is a company limited by guarantee, or a not-for-profit in a more known term. We're based in Wakefield. We support our regional NHS system, covering 3 integrated care boards of South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire and Humber and North Yorkshire, and we support the delivery of innovation projects. Our staff have the breadth of experience within healthcare, public services, pharma and more, and we support a range of activities from promoting a culture of innovation, supporting innovators with real-world evaluations and system engagement, and responding to regional healthcare needs with innovative programmes of work. We're a medium-sized business with 50 to 80 members of staff annually, and we have a single office base in Wakefield with staff working hybridly to deliver on activities. To support development of a carbon reduction plan, I've tried to break down activity into helpful steps. They include step 1, developing your carbon accounting, step 2, defining your net zero ambition, step 3, identifying carbon reduction projects, step 4, approval, and step 5, publication. To start with, we'll look at potentially the trickiest task, determining your carbon footprint. One of the first steps when developing a carbon reduction plan is considering the resource available to you and the expertise you may require. There are lots of organisations available to support you with calculating your carbon footprint, lots of resources and lots of courses you could invest in, but what is the right fit for your organisation? As an organisation, you should consider the pros and cons of external advice and the associated costs before progressing. However you choose to progress with development of your carbon reduction plan, you will always need an internal team to support collecting data, interpreting activity, developing carbon reduction projects appropriate for your organisation, and seeking approval prior to publication. As an organisation, Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber committed to an internal team to deliver our carbon reduction plan, and have used publicly available tools to support capture and conversion of data to estimate our carbon footprint. Other health innovation networks have opted for the support of an external consultant, so there is no right or wrong answer, just the right fit for you. As we opted for internal development, our next step was to identify the emissions sources by scope for our organisation from the carbon reduction plan standards. On screen, you can see the types of emissions we have identified for our organisation, which will be subject to the activity delivered by your organisation. For example, if you manufacture products, your Scope 1 may be significantly different to ours. Once you have identified your emissions by scope, It is then important to determine where your data will come from, the source, and who will have access to that data, the owner. As an example, you can see our electricity consumption was extracted from our utility bills that were held by our finance team. The data owners will form part of your internal delivery team, and it is important that they are aware of expectations for carbon accounting and your organisational commitment to deliver. From the previous slide, you'll note how much data you may be dealing with from numerous potential sources. To help make it easier, it's really important to define the scope of your organisation. So think about the number of buildings that you have, the company assets that you may hold, so company vehicles, number of staff that you may employ, and the business activities that you deliver. After you define the scope of your organisation, you can then explore reporting periods, which may be dictated by the data you have available for your baseline. Then to help with what data to collect for each emission type, you'll need to explore data requirements per conversion factor. My on-screen, possibly a little bit small example is Scope 3 emissions for staff travel, more specifically train travel. And you can see that we use travel expenses data to interrogate our travel footprint. So for my example, you'll see I needed the kilometres travelled and the type of train to support conversion to kilograms of CO2 equivalent. You may also want to consider how the emissions for this type may be managed and collect additional data to inform your interrogation and reduction targets. So for example, we collected details on travellers to explore trends in individuals and team habits. You may then need to combine emissions data for multiple elements. So in my example, that covers multiple modes of transport to give you a total figure. So we combined air travel, land travel by car, train, taxi and bus. It's important to remember that you may be limited by the data that you have available, but as long as you are transparent about your data sources and assumptions made, your carbon footprint will always be an estimate. It's also essential that your carbon footprint can be reproduced on an annual basis, with the ability to indicate where improvements are due to reporting process rather than reduction projects. So from that very quick overview of how to determine your organisational footprint, I wanted to highlight the following. Firstly, ensure your internal team, so your carbon reduction plan lead and data owners are included in defining the data requirements and are aware of the importance of the activity. Then it's really helpful to keep track of data requirements, including sources of data, internal owners, and the progress on conversion. This will help you manage the volume of data to process and consider future improvements to reporting. It will also help you to escalate delays if you're struggling to make progress. Then it's really helpful to remember to track the assumptions you make by scope. You'll be managing lots of information and will likely need to make several assumptions. Keeping a note will ensure you can be transparent when reporting and can reproduce it in the same way for annual updates. Some examples of rules and assumptions that we used include for air travel class, we assumed average passengers in accordance with our travel policy, unless it was stated otherwise in our expenses information. We also use mileage conversion based on mileage remuneration rates for pence per mile to understand the distances that staff were travelling. And we also recorded which mileage calculators we used to identify air miles for air travel and train distances for train travel. And finally, an indication is better than no answer. You can always refine in time, but an understanding of Scope 1 and 2 emissions is essential, and a subset of Scope 3 is really helpful. Once you have your carbon footprint, your baseline or your annual update, you can use that to inform your ambitions and your carbon reduction projects. As previously mentioned, the NHS has 2 targets reflective of its footprint and influence on emissions. In accordance with the supplier roadmap, all organisations seeking to contract with the NHS from April 2027 will need to align to the NHS Carbon Footprint Plus target of 2045. Currently, the minimum expectation is in line with the UK Government technical standards and is to 2050. When setting your organisational ambition, it may also be worthwhile exploring sector and industry ambitions appropriate to your organisation. For example, individual NHS settings may have altered ambitions, and alignment or awareness of those may be favourable to you. Lastly, it's also worth noting current NHS position on offsetting when considering net zero ambitions. The NHS is committed to exhausting activity to reduce emissions within Scope 1 and 2 before accepting or moving on to any mitigation through offsetting. So now on to carbon reduction projects to support delivery of net zero ambitions. As an organisation, we have taken the approach of using our carbon footprint to inform our carbon reduction projects, similar to the NHS activity and outlined in delivering a net zero NHS. From our footprint, we have identified travel, electricity and goods and services as our current priorities and are planning to explore travel data to understand employee travel habits, with the ambition to engage with high impact groups to explore barriers and incentives to active travel and self-reflection on travel patterns. We also intend to optimise promotion of existing perks, such as sustainable vehicle leasing schemes and bus and train fare schemes, to engage with our teams. We then plan to interrogate our electricity use data to identify activities linked to peak usage and, where appropriate, explore innovation, for example, equipment shutdown programmes, with an aim to reduce our overall usage. And we also intend to explore our goods and services contracts to develop policy for sustainable procurement. Lastly, we also have ambitions to develop our organisational culture so that everyone has an awareness of individual and organisational footprints and can start to interrogate activity to deliver against sustainability ambitions. Following determining carbon footprinting, setting ambitions and identifying reduction projects, your carbon reduction plan will be ready for board and director approval and publication. It's important to factor in time to achieve appropriate approvals reflective of your organisational structure. To help with this process, it may be beneficial to emphasise the collaborative development with internal teams to support confidence in data gathered and interrogation. Ensure mechanisms are in place to review all elements of a carbon reduction plan. That could be interrogation of the carbon accounting, your net zero ambitions and carbon reduction projects. This may include external validation of your carbon footprint, but not a requirement at this stage, but may improve your sustainability maturity assessment that Heidi may come on to in the Evergreen supplier assessment framework. Next, it may be beneficial to raise awareness of your activity, translate your carbon footprint into metrics with meaning for teams, and highlight intentions for carbon reduction projects to engage with all of your team. All of the above will demonstrate efforts to deliver your carbon reduction plan and hopefully support with your request to appropriate signatories. It's worth noting you may have multiple signatories dependent upon your organisational structure. Finally, your carbon reduction plan should be ready to publish. So what's required? Your carbon reduction plan must be publicly available, usually in an appropriate location on your organisational website. It must be updated annually, preferably reflecting the same reporting timeframe from baseline for determination of progress. You may also want to consider additional promotion of your activity as a great message to share with staff and key stakeholders. If you do want to share wider, consider how you convey messages, as kilograms of CO2 equivalent doesn't have much meaning to most people. Your commitment to environmental sustainability and net zero ambitions is important and should be talked about. Lastly from me, I quickly wanted to reflect on feedback from innovators that we have supported. So last year we undertook a review with 10 innovators engaged in NHS England funding programmes and explored their experiences of NHS net zero ambitions. We were keen to explore their awareness, understand progress to date and support required to help in achieving those net zero ambitions. Some of the key themes from feedback included: what is the NHS doing to achieve net zero ambitions? We hear a lot about the requirements for suppliers, but why is all the burden on us? And do procurement teams understand the barriers to us from more policy? So in response to that feedback, I've linked to the Greener NHS website, which demonstrates all of the great work within the system to achieve net zero. Please do have a look if you get the chance. It was also noted as well about the NHS priorities and the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare definition of the triple bottom line. So what's important to the NHS is it's clinically effective, cost effective, and then also sustainable. So the NHS is committed to net zero, but an organisation's sustainability credentials and innovation sustainable impacts will not win you a contract alone. Then there were lots of questions about when is the right time to invest in sustainability. It requires time, tools and skills to determine your carbon footprint and to develop a carbon reduction plan. And how do we have confidence that our claims are appropriate and won't be scrutinised by our competitors? So it's really important to consider when is the right time for you to develop your carbon reduction plan and start that carbon footprinting process. And finally, what support is available and how do I translate that into progress? So as I've walked you through today, there are lots of tools out there and lots of organisations available to support you. But it really has to be up to your organisation as to when the right time is for you to progress that development. So thank you very much everyone for listening, and please do get in touch if you have any questions.